So I'm not going to give a lot of introduction. Some of you may have already seen this at the webinar a couple of weeks ago. This is my second one. It may be your first time seeing me, but I will like to just jump right into the topic and give you more about me personally as I develop the topic. I've also got my slides sent to Justin, so he'll be able to distribute those immediately after the call. So to begin with today, I'd like you to just take a minute to reflect on your life and perhaps where you were in your career, if that's applicable, in the year 1994. So just think about 20 years ago now, where were things in the world of your career and your type of work and just in the world in 1994. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to think about that. Got some images here to help you do so. So in 1994, I happened to be living in Colorado, and it was very early in my career. I had just started my first software development job, and one big thing that was going on there at the time was the building of the then new Denver International Airport. If you've been through the Denver International Airport, you know, probably stood out that it's pretty big, and this was a big deal in Denver at the time. Because of its size, the people that were planning it were convinced that they needed to have a very sophisticated computer-controlled baggage handling system to successfully operate. And unfortunately, delays to the implementation of that system caused very public, very expensive delays to the airport. And I didn't have anything to do with the Denver International Airport at the time, but it definitely stood out in my mind. And I want to use that as sort of a jumping off point to describe the path that led me down, and over the past 20 years, some of the things that I've learned about lean and agile approaches to managing software projects. So as a consultant, I've come to realize that using these approaches requires understanding not only what to do and how to do it, but also why the underlying approach is the way it is. So that's what I'm going to address in my talk today. I'm going to do this in a chronological manner, beginning with lean, because lean has the longest roots or history, if you look at it the way I do. I'm going to talk then about project management and then about agile methods. And these are all big topics, so I'm going to allocate some time to each, a little bit more to lean, a little bit less to project management, somewhere in the middle for agile methods. And I'm going to take you on this historical journey. So I hope that when we're done, you'll have a better perspective on these three approaches and by understanding the context in which they arose. And for each topic, I want to talk about its historic context, some of the unique contributions, and then some questions and answers. And I'm going to do that sort of as rhetorical questions because I'm trying to keep things to 30 minutes. So as we go through those questions, I'll give you a minute to think. Just note those down, and then we can always come back to them. So some facts about Denver International Airport. I said it was big. This runway that you see here is over 3 miles long. I got stuck there one time in a snowstorm, and it turns out it's 12 miles from the terminal to the nearest hotel, which, from my perspective, living in Portland, literally my house in downtown Portland is closer to the airport terminal than the closest hotel is at DIA. So when they were building all this and lots was going on, I was in my first programming job. And a family friend who was mentoring me sent me this article in Scientific American that came out that year called Software's Chronic Crisis. And the essence of that was that the world runs on software, and software really isn't up to the task. That the processes and the way we develop things are creating crises like this one, and it's just going to keep happening until something gets done to fix it. And so I took that very much to heart from where I was, and I wanted to be part of success in changing that. And so as I worked my way up the job hierarchy and tried to do that, I came to a role where I was in project management. And at the time, it felt like, yeah, there was a crisis. Like the toolkit that was available didn't work adequately for what I was trying to do. so that although I was good at planning and keeping track of a relatively large number of details, I could never manage to keep everything sort of in unison, rowing in the same direction. But as I continued in my career, I had the opportunity to learn more and practice more lean and agile methods, and I found that the combination of the different approaches did work for me. So a couple of questions that I want to be able to answer today is how do these lean project management agile approaches compare? And so we can discuss that a little bit when we get to the end. I'd like us to be in a position to do that. And then how has each contributed to addressing software's chronic crisis as it was explained in 1994? Our discussion of lean begins with Henry Ford. Most, I think, and a lot of historians at this point feel that way. So Henry Ford has a quote that is famously attributed to him, and that quote is that, of course, you can have your car in any color you want as long as it's black. So what Henry Ford did is he produced identical cars at high volume, and he was able to then raise productivity and radically lower the cost of production. And it turns out that the way that he did this, one of the ways that he did this was by optimizing things for flow along the production lines. And so the thing with the cars was that if you had different colors, which they tried, that messed up the flow. You had to take them off the assembly line and park them until they dried, and that slowed down production. Since Ford was in a position where he had created a product and he lowered the cost, he kept lowering the cost so that the demand far outstripped supply, he was able to say, we're only going to have one color, and that was basically a production optimization. He was optimizing for flow. And he was so successful in doing that, he was able to keep the prices low, the demand outstripped supply, that he basically delivered exactly the same product with minor modifications for 18 years. And he couldn't keep up with demand. So every time a car rolled off the line, there was somebody there with a check in hand ready to buy it. That, in terms of sustainable competitive advantage, this is something that's unheard of today, to be able to produce one product with demand outstripping supply for 18 years in a row. So Ford is known for pioneering the moving assembly line, but really it's this concept in terms of lean that we remember him for is one-piece flow, where the product is continuous flow all the way through without stopping, without being stored, and delivered directly to a waiting customer. There's customer pull. So the American market was very large, and American manufacturers dominated this mass market period. But the Toyota, when Toyota emerged, they came up in a very different economic climate. So they had been founded before World War II, but the company really got started with automobiles after World War II, and they faced very different circumstances. So American manufacturing by this time of cars had moved on and become much more complex and had a little bit moved away from the one-piece flow. But Toyota studied Ford, and as part of Reconstruction, there was lots of exchange programs. They picked up where Ford had left off. And so in their early circumstances, they had very limited capital, so they basically couldn't afford to have large inventory of finished goods or parts. They had a small domestic market, so they needed to produce many models for many different product niches. They needed to serve everybody. And they couldn't afford capital investment, so they needed to be able to use simple general purpose equipment for their multiple products that they were delivering. So what emerged is that there wasn't an economic basis for really large batches the way there was in the mass American market. From our current modern perspective, what this is called is the long tail. So if you look at that graph, depending on your screen, you can see that over on the left, there's a green part that's called the head, and the yellow part of the distribution over on the right is called the tail. And the difference is 50-50. So the point is that the mass market is on the left, and the tail on the right is equally sized in terms of market size, but it represents a whole range of unique products. So if you think of today of something like Amazon.com, they're selling a relatively small quantity of a vast array of things to everybody, and that's kind of where Toyota needed to be in their market at the time. So Toyota quietly went along through developing and perfecting their techniques in this economic climate for one-piece flow, around one-piece flow. And nobody in the rest of the world really knew about it until some things happened in the 1970s. They had oil shocks. And so what happened then is that this presented a market opportunity to enter the mass, large American market, because the American manufacturers were just caught flat-footed. They didn't have any small, fuel-efficient vehicles to sell, and it takes a long time to develop a vehicle. So the Japanese manufacturers, including Toyota, were able to gain a toehold, and they did so, and started to make rapid progress. And so then suddenly there was a kind of an existential crisis. And people wondered what was going on. Why were the Japanese manufacturers able to outcompete the American manufacturers all of a sudden? And there was a lot of exchange. So where the Japanese had come over to America after World War II, now American executives started going over to Japan. What they saw, what was visible. And so one of the leading theories at the time, outside of market manipulation and other claims that were made and the trade restrictions that were placed, was they saw robots. They saw one-piece flow, but what stood out in their mind was the automation. And so they assumed that it was automation that was the key to Japanese success. But the point there is that later emerged, and what people now realize is that the automation was just literally a very thin layer. It was the icing on the cake. That having worked for decades and decades to perfect the one-by-one flow, the automation was the very last step. And simply by copying that last step, you couldn't replicate the decades and decades of steady patient learning. So this term lean was actually not something that Toyota invented. Toyota just did things the way they did things. But what happened was, after this sort of crisis, this existential crisis, some researchers at MIT were able to get funding, and they went and studied and compared different auto manufacturers all over the world, and they were able to see what was going on, and they're the ones that coined the term lean and really brought it into the business vocabulary. So lean focuses on removing obstacles to flow. It isn't a tool, as seen by Toyota, necessary for reducing waste. It's an approach centered on improving flow. And value is flow to the customer. Value comes from what the customer will pay for. And anything that doesn't contribute to customer value represents an obstacle, which is potentially can be eliminated, but it isn't the goal to eliminate waste. It's the goal to remove obstacles to flow. So this is the sort of long history of lean in a short capsule that we've talked about. I'm going to ask the question part of this section, and then move on to project management. So the question that I want people to think about for a moment, and we hopefully come back to if there are no questions to begin with at the end, is are conditions in your market today, what you do, whatever that is in your role, more similar to what faced Ford and GM at the time of the when they were creating one-piece flow and then moving into the mass market, or more similar to what Toyota faced? I want to go on now to project management. So project management has been around, some people have been around since the time of the pyramids. Anytime you're trying to organize a large, unique endeavor. But as a discipline, it really arose and came to prominence as a result of Cold War government projects. So a lot of developments had to be made on this project, which was the Polaris missile project. And if you think about what was going on, Eisenhower famously warned against the military-industrial complex. He was frustrated with this sort of relationship between the Defense Department and the hysteria need to build weapon systems and defense contractors. And with this particular project, what was going on is that they had this concept of mutually assured destruction. They needed to create missiles. So the missiles that they were putting on these submarines were not very accurate. They were second strike missiles. So the idea is that if there's a massive preemptive attack and somebody destroys everything on the United States homeland, these submarines are constantly out in the ocean and they'll be able to retaliate. And that will then prevent people from attacking in the first place because they know that they can't win. So that's the type of logic that was going on when project management techniques first began to be developed. So for example, in the Polaris missile project was the PERT technique developed, the Program Evaluation and Review Technique, which is basically fairly commonplace today in terms of mathematics, given the computational capabilities and advances since then, but it was quite revolutionary at the time. It used a graph, a network or a graph to analyze where resources might need to be adjusted to maximize the schedule. So the point was, in that sort of Cold War hysteria, people were not interested in saving money or limiting scope. In fact, at the time of the Polaris project, there were 7 or 8 other similar, arguably competing or redundant projects going on at the same time. So they were trying to spend money like crazy to avoid the end of the world, basically, in the view at the time. And that's where these techniques like PERT became available. Shortly after, the critical path method and the work breakdown structure and so on were developed and systematized after that. So project management developed from those roots, and it eventually became popularized business through this proven business model of certification. So basically people developed these methodologies or bodies of knowledge, and then there was lots of certification classes, and eventually when things finally came together, the spread was quite wide. So the timeline there, looking back as we did with Lean, is from the Cold War in the late 50s through really the early 1990s. So if you think about 1994 and that software's chronic crisis and the Denver International Airport, that was really about the same time that project management certification really started to take off. So arguably, that's one alternative that people were looking at that time in response to the chronic crisis is more and better project management. So in terms of the questions that we might ask at this point about project management, and this is where a connector to Lean, one question is, the question is whether your customer is willing to pay for project management. Or is project management something that is a candidate from a Lean standpoint for elimination? And that's sort of a provocative question, kind of a philosophical question. Well, I wanted to ask it to get people thinking about that. Then the next question is, in your own experience, perhaps as a project manager or similar role, which variable is typically most flexible in your projects? So project management training always talks about the iron triangle, or usually does, of scope, schedule, and budget. So which variable is typically most flexible in your actual practical experience? The next topic I'm going to talk about is the third, is agile development. So agile turns things on its head, whereas normally we start by fixing scope and then derive budget and schedule from that. That's the sort of typical or normal mode, arguably, in project management. Agile turns that over and says, we can make scope variable with the techniques and the technologies and the ways of doing things that we know how to do. Scope can be variable. We can vary scope in order to maximize value. So we're able to make budget and schedule very predictable by varying scope. And they're able to do this by being what we call iterative and incremental. So what does that mean? So incrementing builds things a little bit at a time. So you have an idea, you have a vision, and you basically build it in stages. You do the top half first, and then you add another piece, and then you add a third piece, and finally you're done. But incrementing calls, you have to have a fully formed idea. You have to have the whole plan to begin with. So if you want to change the plan, that may not necessarily work out. If you want to change the color of the dress or something like that, after you've done number one, you've already got the shoulder showing there, you've got some rework to do. So incrementing is nothing new under the sun. This, project management has tried to do this for a long time. What's different in Agile is not necessarily the idea, but the delivery on the idea of being able to do things iteratively. So if you're iterating, you build a rough version, and then you validate it, and then you slowly build up the fidelity or the resolution or the quality. So you have this general idea, which you share as soon as it's viable and can be communicated. Then you sketch that out. You gradually add resolution to it. People can see what's going on. They can provide feedback. You can provide feedback yourself by seeing the thing you're building. And finally, you iterate until it's done or done enough, and then you're able to deliver it. So iterating allows you to move from vague idea to realization, which is one of the fundamental underlying, or perhaps the fundamental underlying tenet of Agile. Because if you do that, you're able to change in response to feedback, and you're able to deliver potentially sooner if you decide that a sketch is good enough for your purposes for now. You can deliver that. You can move on to some other project or painting, and you can come back and add to that sketch later. So in my journey, and one of the first things that really became popular with respect to Agile is extreme programming. The idea with extreme programming is if a practice works and it's good or great, then take it to the extreme. So for example, if you have code reviews and those work well, then take it to the extreme. That's pair programming, where you're basically doing a code review on a constant basis. You have one person programming, the other person reviewing it while they write. At the same time, and sort of co-evident with extreme programming, but it took a little bit longer to take hold, was Scrum. So Scrum has a lot of overlaps with extreme programming. However, it was more focused on the work process side of things and less on the technical practices. And so Scrum, eventually, because those work processes are perhaps more accessible to managers and decision makers, or perhaps because they're easier to decide to implement, they take less long-term discipline and learning. Scrum was very, very successful. But at the time that they were both around again, when we go back 20 years to the time of the Denver International Airport, where they were both, people were working on them, but they were not widely known as potential solutions to solve this chronic crisis. There was a number of other parallel things going on, and so people came together in 2001, and that's really when the name Agile was christened or coined, and things really started to move forward under that banner. So just like Lean, Agile existed for a long time. It had its roots in object-oriented programming and people who knew how to do object-oriented programming and wanted to find a better way to take advantage of that. And so it was around for a long time, but it was really sort of named and christened in about 2001. And similar to project management, what happened with Agile is that Agile became known, and Scrum organized itself under that umbrella, and then Scrum basically carried the idea of Agile very widely through this proven process of, at least for the people that are doing the certifications, proven the spreading of Agile by taking this training course and then becoming certified as a Scrum Master. So overall, in this timeline, the Scrum the authors of Scrum and others had this roots in this article by some Japanese business author called the New Product Development Game. That's not a typo. That's really what the article was called. And my point of showing this is that they were referencing some ideas from Japan that this was before Lean had been widely popularized in the press. So they were focusing on some of the common ideas, but they weren't necessarily starting out with this idea of we need to adapt Lean. They were starting from a common set of ideas that hadn't yet been christened as Lean. Many Scrum and Agile, Scrum and XP and many other variants came along, and then they really came under this banner of Agile in about 2001. So Agile isn't so much a project management methodology as like Lean. It's a way of working. It's an adaptive way of working, which has some fundamental tenets or principles. You want to keep scope variable, defer detailed planning until the last responsible moment, to deliver incrementally and iteratively in order to reduce batch size, and to maximize the value of work not done, which is to say, if you learn through feedback by delivering early, you don't necessarily have to be more efficient or deliver more lines of code if you can avoid delivering the ones that nobody is going to use anyway. So what are some of the questions we might ask at this point? If about Agile. One question is, are Scrum and Agile the same thing? So that's one question that you should be able to answer at this point. Another question is, did Agile come from Lean? And again, we've just covered that. So that's another question that hopefully something you'll now be able to answer as you go forward and you're talking about the two together. So what I've told you is kind of a very brief whirlwind tour at a 50,000 foot or 30,000 foot level of Lean project management and Agile methods, and where they were in time relative to this period 20 years ago today when software's chronic crisis was identified or named. So Lean began with Henry Ford, one-piece flows perfected by Toyota, and it was kind of revealed to the world around 1990. So it was very new at this time in 1994. Project management emerged out of this military-industrial complex. It spread to business, and then it was later applied to IT and software. And Agile methods were in some ways a reaction to dysfunction in projects resulting from the application of project management to IT and software. But they also really came from people having a new way of doing things. They had object-oriented technologies, and they were looking for an expression of practices that would best take advantage of the best available technology. So I hope that by seeing these in this overall context that you've been able to gain some perspective on how they might fit as you contemplate using Lean and Agile methods for your projects and for your IT work. So I wanted to just close by a couple of points. So how can we consider like how these different approaches might have or might be applied to change the chronic crisis? And I believe that software has largely addressed this, and I'm proud that software has really gone from being this poster child for crisis and to a poster child for a way of adaptive planning and working, and really the kind of starting point for adapting Lean methods to knowledge work as we go forward into the 21st century. That's exciting for me to have been a small part of that. I think project management, if you read the case study, if you're interested in going more in depth, project management could really have contributed risk management to the Denver International Airport problem. If the people were aware of the risks that were existing, the fact that nobody's ever done this before, they would have and realized that they were making this baggage handling system the critical path. So they wouldn't have gotten to the point where it was costing $1.75 million a day to not have the airport open. if they had managed risks better. Lean would have said, rather than try to come out of the first day with a fully formed automated system, like those robots in the factories, let's first gradually and patiently understand the system before we try to fully automate it. And Agile would have tried to get something working, so you would have had something working on the first day the airport opened, even if it wasn't perfect, and then you'd be able to adapt to feedback from the different stakeholders, passengers, and airlines, and so on as you go. If there's one message that I want to leave you with, is that Agile and Lean are not just approaches that you can install the way you can install a new engine, or you might think you could. They're really a way of thinking about your work, and changing your way of thinking is a gradual process. But you can do it. There's lots of techniques from psychology and learning that have also developed in the past 20 years for breaking things down into very specific practices. And you can begin to learn as you practice to change your mindset, and that benefit then builds up and accrues from that. So people can look at different perspectives and think in different ways, but if you're not thinking about something consciously, if you're not thinking about the way you do things consciously, that doesn't mean you don't have a mindset, even if you're not explicitly aware of it. So in order to change your mindset, you need to first become aware of your present mindset. That's the first step. So with that, I want to turn things over for questions. I wanted to just say that there's going to be one more webinar that I'm doing. There's many more in the series, and they're all different and interesting, and I'm excited that you'll be able to put this great series together. But the last one that I'm doing is this one, where I'm going to talk about a case study on a project that I did that was interesting, where Agile methods sort of took hold in the software development and then spread into the physical infrastructure of the project. And you can, if you don't get your questions answered, or if you have more that you want to discuss, please feel free to contact me here and at these by phone or email. And again, you'll have a copy of these slides, so you can have this information there as well. So with that, I went a few minutes past half an hour, but I tried really hard to follow the format. So I am happy to go back anywhere and answer any of the questions that I posed, or any questions that you may have to pose. And I'm going to turn back over to Justin to moderate that.
All right, thanks, Adam. That concludes Adam's presentation. We're moving on to the Q&A portion. We've got about 25 minutes for Q&A. You can use the chat window to send questions to me privately or via public chat, and we will get them to Adam. We had one question come in, but it looks like she actually realized that you had already answered it about the baggage planning and construction on the Denver International Airport. So go ahead.
What was the question?
She asked about the failure of the planning and construction on Denver International Airport, but she realized you had already answered that as part of the presentation. So the next one I have says, Agile emphasizes self-organizing teams. So in Agile, what role do project managers play?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question, and that's always something that is part of the initial adoption questions that arise.
Okay, I got one more piece of detail from him, just asking about, specifically in relation to the roles of product owner and Scrum Master. How does a project manager fit in there?
Sure. Okay. So, the answer to many things is that it depends. Basically, just to reiterate what the roles are for people that are familiar about, the Scrum Master is fundamentally, like in Lean terms, would be a process owner. They're responsible for the functioning of the team as a process, following the Agile processes and in the spirit as well as the practices, and helping the team form and be successful. And the team is responsible for the work. The product owner, we said that Agile works by making scope variable. And so the product owner is basically at the helm of the scope, prioritizing and being the arbiter of value, deciding what gets done first if you're developing iteratively and incrementally. So then obviously that raises the question of, well, if the project manager if the team's self-organized and the project manager is not needed to get the team together anymore, and somebody else is in charge of scope, then obviously as a project manager you might wonder, well, how's my role going to change? And that's in fact what almost always happens. So there's different sets of things. One thing is that sometimes project managers find they have an affinity and that they are really interested in moving into one of those roles. So I see a lot of project managers desiring to become Scrum Masters. There's also a reality that in a large organization, the sweet spot of Agile and Scrum is really in the development part of the life cycle of an initiative. But in a large organization and in initiatives that many times include much more than just the software development part of the life cycle, there's a lot of room where project management still is required. It is enveloping and going upstream and downstream of that software development part of the life cycle. So I guess three answers. One is to take on one of those other roles, and two is to basically expand the focus upstream, and then a third is really to become a servant leader or a helper. So it's, the way of looking at it is that it's not that project management skills aren't very valuable to team members. It's just that instead of the project manager driving the team is pulling on the project manager for those skills.
All right, thanks. Next question, is there a use case of managing an Agile project using the Microsoft Project Server tool?
So I have not really focused, I'm not really focused on tools in my practice. I think, the best tools are whatever your organization needs. I don't have a specific case study. There are certainly many organizations that have used Microsoft Project and have continued to use it when they've done Agile. The way I think that is most useful is as a scenario planning tool. So at some point, what Microsoft Project is good at is putting together all those potential future events and kind of helping people to visualize the interaction of those things and say, how would this all fit together if we did it this way? And you can do that. I've seen teams do that within the sprint to say, how are we going to get all this stuff done in 3 weeks with the people that we have, or 2 weeks? So I've seen it used at that scale. And I've seen it used at a much larger scale where often the team is just sort of moving forward 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and they don't necessarily have the skills or the attention to have the big deal to say, okay, that's fine, but where's this going to be in 9 months? And so Project is very helpful at painting a picture of the future that then people can respond to once they can see it.
All right. Next question. Rex says, interesting views on history. What does this mean today for state employees considering using Agile?
Well, that's a good question. I have to, in some cases, maybe it'd help me to know more if I knew more about what specific plans were in any given area. I think that the importance of history is, again, as I said, the importance of understanding the relevance to your situation. So if you understand that your current situation is a matter of serving a very large, disparate, changing, complex set of needs, and that you can't predict what those needs will be, and that you have to serve all of those different sources of demand, if you will, in the IT context, then you can begin to understand the why behind developing or switching to Agile. So I think that's what I would say at this stage from this presentation, what I would hope to say is that you can see that the problems that are challenging you, if you look at what the really is deeper behind them, then you can see the fit between those challenges, or the partial fit or lack of fit, whatever may be the case, between those problems and the methodologies that you might be trying to employ. So you're basically going into it with eyes open, understanding the problem solution match.
All right, great. Another question, referring back to the iron triangle slide that you had it flipped on your head for Agile compared to the traditional approach. What was the significance of that? Was that importance or flexibility that was being defined there? And what do you think are what are the ones that get neglected in projects that fail, and the ones that tend to get, a project that pays a lot of attention to will tend to succeed or be more likely to succeed?
Right. Well, so I would argue that in my experience, and I think it's somewhat inherent in the way things are, the state of the practice or the norms in the industry, that people typically get a sense of some kind of scope and then they anchor on that. And so what tends to happen is people are slow or unwilling to change scope, or perhaps more often they just don't know how. And so whatever scope they start with kind of gets away from them, and it gets sent out to everybody, and everybody says that's what we're doing or that's what we're building. And so they have difficulty changing scope after the project is started. So basically schedule and scope tends to get more fixed, and schedule and budget tend to be varied in response to that. That's just, a very broad generalization and my view of kind of the norms. So the problem with that is that schedule sets, like we saw in the example of the Edinburgh International Airport, can be very costly. Like missing a date, in that case, in today's dollars, was costing $1.75 million a day. They would have been very happy at that point to bring on extra staff to handle baggage, to do, virtually anything to get the airport open. Because if you think about a big event like that, like everybody was standing by to like one day be, at Stapleton, and the next day move all their trucks and open up at DIA, and they weren't able to do it because of this, basically the lack of ability to vary scope. So I'm not sure if I'm still right on track with the question there, but the essence of it is that in terms of practicality, being able to vary scope is a very attractive way to move forward. It gives you a lot of optionality, and in a complex, changing world, that's highly advantageous. And so, from a business competitiveness standpoint, is a very attractive feature of the ability to be able to do things with Agile. So I think arguably Agile, you have a time box at every scale, whether it's the sprint or the release, and so you're fixing your budget, which is basically the size of your team and how much they cost to pay, your schedule, which is how much time you're allowing to do some work, and then you get feedback on your scope, and you're able to vary that. So it gives you a fine-grained control that a lot of people felt was lacking in the way that they did things previously.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a great answer. So we still have quite a bit of time for more questions. If anyone wants to send in some questions, we can get to you right away. Had one other question for you here. So we've talked a lot about the past leading up to the current point. Where does that trajectory point in your mind? Do you think that we'll see a sort of a formal fusion of Lean and Agile under some new banner, or do you think people will just continue to use the pieces that they need for the current situation?
Sure, that's a really good question. And in fact, I have a longer version of this presentation where I go into that a little bit more and kind of go past the Agile Manifesto and say, well, what happened since then? What we're seeing is definitely that fusion, and people are really working out how to match Lean and the thinking and principles from Lean manufacturing, also from sort of parallel development of something that people call lean product development, and how those things really can apply to software development. The idea is, really one metaphor, which may not be perfect, is kind of developing a software factory, so that you find out that really it's hard to, and even with Agile and a lot of good techniques and a lot of good learning over a 15 or so year period, you're not going to have a team that forms really well, an Agile team that forms really well every time. There's going to be some just cases where a team doesn't form well. So in the idea of a factory metaphor there is that once you get that team up and working on an initiative and they're a good team and they understand the skills for a specific domain, then really flipping things around and saying well, let's consider what we're doing as a platform or a stream of work items, and we can do away with the sort of overhead and variability and kind of waste of startup and stop of an initiative by organizing and arranging things so that that team is continuously brought new scope items and they can work on that continuously. And at that point, it's just an arbitrary start and end where you say this work was one project and this other work was the next project. So that's definitely the fusion of Agile and Lean is really where most of the intellectual energy is, and there's a lot of really smart people working on that. So that's an exciting thing, because I think seeing a lot of productivity benefits emerge on a day by day and year by year basis.
Okay. Next up, what advice would you give to a traditional project manager trying to break into the Agile world? Should they read a book? Should they go get a certification? Should they get a trainer? What's most effective there?
So I think all those things are good to do. The getting knowledge of things is really important. I think really the best, I guess, the best simple advice is to go and get some knowledge on how. So something like the Scrum Master training is good, although somewhat limited in its scope. Doesn't apply to everything, but as a project manager, you'll see probably where it does and doesn't apply. There's other training for different areas, like the PMI now has Agile training. So it's good to get training that's practical, though, that really tells you how to do something, and then find an opportunity, whatever that opportunity is, to start practicing. And then as you start practicing, go deeper, understand some of the things that I've been trying to explain today in terms of the underlying reasons why the principles behind Agile in terms of things like batch size reduction and one-piece flow. Go deeper, read books, understand Lean and Lean software development and how that applies to what you're doing. But you're going to learn the most, and you're going to, raise your skill level the fastest if you're able to continue that learning about why while you're doing the how, and you're really putting stuff into practice on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, and it sounds like from what you said that the traditional project management organizations that already exist are already on board with this and starting to offer content for their members on Agile techniques.
Yeah, well, the Project Management Institute, which is the people behind the Project Management Body of Knowledge and the certification that goes with that, they have launched an Agile certification. They're sort of late to the game, but I think that the content is good. It's as good a place as any to start. You may not think that it's worth studying all the modules or actually taking the certification, but I think that much of the training that's coming up around that is quite good, and it's especially good because it's geared to the bridge. It's geared to the bridge of a project manager that doesn't have that experience in getting that experience. So that has something to recommend it.
Okay. So we don't currently have any more questions in the queue. We've got about 9 minutes left. So if anyone does have a question they've been waiting to ask, now would be the time. We'll give everyone a couple minutes to respond, and if we don't have anything, then we can call this to a close and let everybody get to lunch. If there's anything else you'd like to share while we're waiting for a question, feel free, Adam.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a burning need to, it's hard for me to read the audience on the webinar, so it's hard for me to know where people are at or what's on their mind, so the feedback is helpful. I can go back to some of the rhetorical questions that I asked, but I think people had plenty of chance to do that, so I'm just going to wait.
No problem. Yeah, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I just wanted to give people a chance to send their question in if they still had one. We had one question from Lynn asking, will the audio part of this be posted on the web? Yes, we'll have the video and the audio. It'll be posted to the OCIO website on the Agile-Fridays page. Okay, so my sense is we've exhausted the questions for today. Okay. We have one stuck in here. Let's see. Okay, Mike says, I missed the first couple minutes. Could you just give a brief summary of the Denver problem and how that related to the content of the talk?
Sure. Yeah, I can go back and just give a quick case study. So basically what happened, it's pretty interesting. When I was making this presentation, I did read some project managers who had done a case study of this. What happened is that Denver decided their mayor had a vision. They made a big bet that they wanted to build this new airport. And so the old airport was kind of in the city and hard to expand. And so they moved this thing way out in the direction of Kansas, out in the middle of nowhere. And they built this fast airport. And so at the time they had this very large, and the people that were designing it, engineering it, wanted to build a baggage handling system because it's actually almost like a mile from where the planes, some of the terminals where the planes land to where you're supposed to pick up your bags. So it's really vast, and so they wanted to have a way to get that baggage there fast, and so they envisioned this automatic baggage handling system. But the system was plagued with problems, and the whole project was dependent on it working. And so at the end of when it was supposed to open, there was all these hugely embarrassing problems with the baggage system that dragged on for a long time, and the bond ratings turned to junk, and there was all these political fallout from this basic project management problem. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
All right, great. We had a request to show another slide again. I believe it's slide number 33, the Agile equals adaptive way of working.
Sorry for the, I think it's easier for me to go this way than to, yeah, okay, got it.
All right, great. And that was from Anne-Marie. I just wanted to say, Anne-Marie, we will also have the slides posted along with the recording of the video. The slides we can usually post right after the presentation. It takes an hour or two to convert and upload the video. So that's usually available by Monday morning. All right, well, I think we're about out of time in questions here. So thank you everyone for participating, and thanks for your great questions. Agile Friday is going to be on hiatus for the next couple of weeks, but we'll be returning on May 16th with Jean Maria Sola, Gwen Trentum, Maureen Noonan, and Alan Chetalawada, who you might remember from a previous talk. They're from the University of Washington, and they're going to be sharing information about their Lean Agile Transition case study that they underwent. So you can find out more about what's coming up, and you can view previously recorded webinars as well as the slides at ocio.wa.gov/agile-fridays. Once again, a big thanks to Adam, SOTEC Advisors, and also our partners, Results Washington, for helping to make Agile Fridays a success. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great weekend. See you next time. Thanks, Adam.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.